History is built on names. Kings carved them into stone. Empires stamped them onto coins. Victors forced the world to remember them. This king did the opposite. He ruled one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. He commanded armies, ordered monuments raised, and spoke with the authority of a god. His reign should have echoed across centuries. Instead, his name was stripped from walls, his statues smashed, his images chiseled away until only scars remained. It was not accident. It was not decay. It was erasure. And for thousands of years, it worked. When archaeologists first uncovered the ruins of his kingdom, they noticed something strange. Temples stood unfinished. Reliefs showed figures whose faces had been carefully destroyed. Inscriptions stopped abruptly, as if the stone itself had been silenced. There were gaps where a king should have been, a reign that should have existed, but didn't, at least not anymore. In the ancient world, power depended on permanence. To rule was to leave a mark so deep that even time could not remove it. Kings understood this better than anyone. They built monuments not for their people, but for eternity. This king did too. At the height of his power, his empire stretched farther than it ever had before. Trade flowed through its cities. Armies guarded its borders. Priests spoke his name in temples, invoking him alongside the gods. He was not weak. He was not insignificant. He was dangerous. And that may be why history tried to kill him. His rise was sudden and disruptive. He did not inherit a calm kingdom. He inherited a system built on tradition, one that relied on a delicate balance between political authority and religious power. And he shattered it. From the moment he took the throne, he began to dismantle the world his ancestors had built. He challenged the priesthood. He undermined ancient rituals. He questioned beliefs that had defined his civilization for over 1,000 years. He did not just rule differently, he ruled against tradition. At first, his changes seemed manageable. Kings often reformed institutions or elevated favored gods. That was normal. But this king went further. He demanded exclusivity. He elevated a single divine force above all others. Temples dedicated to old gods were closed or neglected. Priests lost influence. Rituals that had governed daily life were quietly abandoned. For a civilization whose identity was inseparable from its gods, this was not reform. It was revolution. The king believed he was right. His inscriptions, the few that survived, speak of divine truth, cosmic order, and destiny. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a purifier. He was correcting history. The people did not agree. The priesthood resisted quietly at first, then openly. The nobility grew uneasy. The army remained loyal, but loyalty alone could not stabilize a kingdom whose spiritual foundations were cracking. Still, the king pressed forward. He built a new capital from nothing, a city raised in defiance of tradition. Its location was deliberate, chosen far from the old religious centers. It was meant to represent a clean break from the past, a new world. For a time, it worked. The king ruled from his new city, issuing decrees, commissioning art unlike anything seen before. The old rigid styles gave way to something more intimate, more human. He portrayed himself not as an untouchable god-king, but as a living man beneath divine light. It was unprecedented and deeply unsettling, because in making himself human, he weakened the very illusion that sustained royal authority. While the king reshaped culture, the empire's borders began to fray. Foreign territories grew restless. Allies asked for military support and received silence. The king was consumed by ideology, not conquest. Letters arrived begging for help. They went unanswered. The empire did not collapse overnight, but it began to bleed slowly, territory by territory, city by city. The machinery of power still existed, but its focus had shifted inward. The king was building a future while the present burned. Then, suddenly, his reign ended. There was no dramatic assassination, no recorded coup, no civil war inscribed in stone. He simply vanished. And that is when the real destruction began. His successors moved quickly. Too quickly. They abandoned his city almost immediately. His reforms were reversed. The old gods were restored. The priesthood returned with vengeance, determined to erase not just his ideas, but his existence. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns of historical destruction ever recorded. His name was hacked out of inscriptions. His images were defaced. His statues were smashed or repurposed. Monuments he commissioned were dismantled, their stones reused for other kings. Official records skipped from his predecessor to his successor as if nothing had happened in between. It was deliberate. Ancient civilizations believed that memory was survival. To be remembered was to live forever in the afterlife. To be forgotten was the true death. They sentenced their king to oblivion. Even his family was erased. His wife's images disappeared. His children were renamed or removed from records. Entire decades were rewritten as if they had never occurred. For centuries, no one knew he existed. Later rulers took credit for his buildings, scribes altered timelines. The official history became smooth, seamless, and false, and the world accepted it. When classical historians later wrote about this civilization, they followed the records they had. The erased king did not appear because he no longer existed on paper or stone. History had been edited. It worked so well that when archaeologists first uncovered evidence of the missing reign, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Broken statues with unfamiliar styles, buildings with no clear owner, gaps in king lists that made no sense. Something was missing. But what? Slowly, fragments emerged. A name partially preserved in an obscure inscription, a foreign reference that didn't match the accepted timeline, art that did not fit the rigid conventions of known rulers. Piece by piece, the erased king returned. Not because history wanted him back, but because erasure is never perfect. Chisel marks leave scars. Destroyed names leave outlines. Silence leaves questions. As scholars reconstructed his reign, a new picture emerged. This was not a mad tyrant or a weak ruler. He was a radical, a visionary, a king who tried to reshape reality itself. And he failed. But not because he was insignificant, because he was too disruptive. His ideas threatened the foundations of power. His reforms weakened institutions that had survived for centuries. His successors understood something he did not. Survival depended on continuity. So they destroyed him. The irony is that his erasure became his legacy. By attempting to delete him from history, his enemies created one of history's greatest mysteries. His absence drew attention. His missing reign demanded explanation. And once rediscovered, he became impossible to ignore. Today, his story is studied not as a footnote, but as a warning. A reminder that history is not neutral, that records are written by survivors. That truth can be buried, but rarely forever. The king who erased himself from history did not intend to disappear. He believed his vision would outlive him. Instead, it provoked a backlash so severe that memory itself became a weapon. His greatest failure was not losing power. It was underestimating how far history will go to protect itself. Because in the ancient world, death was not the end. Forgetting was.